I would like to thank you all for coming. A special thank you to our guests who came tonight and were personally invited as members of the Planning Department and Commission, Zoning Board of Appeals, Economic Development, School Board and Superintendents, the Mayor, and of course our Cass County Commissioners. You may also notice that we have some members of the other county governments here with us tonight also. We thank you for serving your county residents by joining us. The Cass County Property Rights Group was formed by a group of concerned citizens eager to learn how a proposed industrial wind project in Cass and Miami counties could affect us. Contrary to rumors, the group is not funded by the coal industry. They are funded solely by their own paychecks and donations. They are not lobbyists, they are not liars, fearmongers, or slanderers. Excuse me. They are none of the things that you may have read or heard. The truth is that the Cass County Property Rights Group is a growing group of friends and neighbors that meet in a barn. You can't get much more grassroots than that. The group formed itself to seek the truth about renewable energy systems, and the truth was surprising. RES's initial proposal in Fulton, Cass, and Miami County included up to 415 industrial. Oh, I am so sorry. Please. I'm a little nervous too.
Hold it right up to your mouth.
Hold it up
to my mouth?
Yes.
Like this?
Yes.
Okay. The group formed itself to seek the truth about renewable energy systems, and the truth was surprising. RES's initial proposal in Fulton, Cass, and Miami County included up to 415 industrial wind turbines that will be between 660 and 820 feet tall. This information was provided to Fulton County officials by Brad Lila, the RES director of the project. To offer some perspective, the tallest building in Indianapolis, the Salesforce Tower, stands 701 feet tall. Building a wind farm that requires land in 3 counties means that the citizens of these counties will be living in the wind farm, not just next to a neighbor's wind turbine. After learning that no other wind farm of this size and scale exists in the United States, citizens became very concerned and decided to take action. And so here we are tonight. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, good. We are gathered together, a group of individuals with real experiences in wind energy. Tonight you will hear from a former planning commissioner and families that live in the wind farms. They will offer their first-hand experiences and a glimpse of what your life may soon be like here in Cass County. Following their presentations, we will have a question and answer session in which your questions will be fielded by a panel of experts: Kevon Martis, Jeremy Kitson, and Craig Mossberg. Please write your questions out on the papers provided in the back and deposit them in the basket. We ask that you save all questions until this time. Feel free to check out the display set up. There are yard signs available, and the only cost is a free will donation. Excuse me. Should you feel led to donate the incurring cost, there is a donation box in the back. Please be assured that anything you can give us is helpful and is used by CCPR specifically for this cause, namely lawyer fees. Most importantly, please be respectful this evening. There's no need for name calling, profanity, or yelling. We are here to learn and educate ourselves. Thank you again for coming tonight. And now for our first speaker of the night, Kevon Martis. Kevon Martis.
Or first, can you hear me? Hello?
How about now?
Yeah. Good.
Our first speaker of the night is someone who has been involved in the big wind debate for years. Kevon Martis is the Executive Director of the Interstate Informed Citizens Coalition of Blissville, Michigan. The IICC is a bipartisan network of grassroots community groups from across the Midwest who live on the front lines of industrial wind energy development. Mr. Martis regularly testifies on energy policy matters in both Michigan and Ohio legislators and before groups like the Mackinac Center for Public Policy and the Audubon Society and the Urban League of Detroit. A former planning commissioner In Southeast Michigan, Mr. Martis has become a trusted resource for communities wrestling with wind energy zoning issues. Over the past 7 years, he has testified in dozens of local zoning hearings and traveled the U.S. from North Dakota to Washington, D.C., and from Michigan to Kentucky. Tonight, Mr. Martis will share with us firsthand experiences in the wind debate. He will explain how industrial wind farms affect safety, health, and welfare of citizens. We welcome Mr. Martis and hope that he can help each and every one of you gain a better understanding of what be becoming the Cass and Miami County. Mr. Martis.
Well, good evening. It's, well, I'd like to say it's a pleasure to be here, but actually I'm sorry that I have to be here to have this discussion with you and your community, because I've been watching these discussions take place since 2009, and things have not changed. It's incredibly divisive. It's harmful to the social fabric of our communities. I've seen a lot of relationships damaged. It's often not a very pretty picture. So I would start out by saying that I'm sorry that I have to be here at all. Secondly, I want to tell you that I'm not here to tell you what to do with your community. That's your choice. I can't force my will upon anybody here. It's often said that I go around and stop wind projects. I can't stop a wind project here. Your county commissioners are not concerned about my vote, because I don't vote here. I don't own property here. But in Indiana, you have the right to make your own land use policy decisions at the county level. And I hope after I'm done speaking to you today, you will come to the conclusion, like I have, that the types of zoning that the wind industry regularly demands and the type of land use policies they want are inconsistent with what we see with most other types of land use. I was interviewed by a newspaper in Florida this summer, and the lady said to me, well, you know, you're something of a rock star. I said, well, that's a little silly. I don't see myself that way at all. I said, and if I wanted to achieve notoriety as a public speaker, I would have chosen the Book of Revelation or human sexuality. I never would have chosen land use policy and zoning, because nobody much cares until a project like this comes along. But nonetheless, here's what we have in front of us, so I won't blab too much. So yes, I'm a former planning commissioner in Southeast Michigan. I'm also a senior policy fellow at the E&E Legal Institute, which I see has caught some folks' attention on social media. I will just say right up front, I'm not paid for either of these positions. Any of the funds that are donated to the IICC through our PayPal account, I cannot take for pay, compensation for my time. And we don't, we can turn in only expenses for mileage and those kinds of things, but only when the funds are available, and they're just simply not always there. So let's be clear about that. And you're already aware, I presume a number of you are aware of the project footprint. You probably know it better than me. But apparently Fulton has decided they're not interested in this project at this point, so we're in the northern parts of Cass and Miami. So who is this guy? Well, I have a degree from the University of Michigan, but then again, so does the Unabomber. I was the vice chairman of my township planning board. I worked on things at the county level like ag land preservation strategies and so forth. But I'm very proud of having helped draft a wind energy ordinance that became a state model wind ordinance. It was added to a list of model ordinances the state of Michigan used to maintain. And ours is down there at the bottom. And a little boilerplate, as things become more and more litigious, the longer I go around and speak. In fact, Friday night I was served a subpoena by NextEra Energy. They want to see all of my emails. I don't know what they're looking for, probably the Koch brothers, but so I will give you some boilerplate. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not here giving you legal advice. And as you work on your ordinance, hopefully you're open to that. Make sure you have competent counsel that's very good with these things. It's a specialty. Not everybody understands land use policy. And let's get the ball in front of the right goalpost here. The wind industry wants us to turn this debate about land use policy in our counties into a debate about how wonderful green energy is, how noble it is, and beneficial for everybody. But the truth is, the only issue that zoning administrators, zoning planning board members have to consider is how to safely place 50, 60, or 70-story tall, noisy structures into a rural residential environment. Whether these structures produce green electricity, extract coal or oil, or turn sow's ears into silk purses is absolutely irrelevant. This is about separating conflicting uses of land and protecting health, safety, and welfare. Nothing more, nothing less. They want to call you anti-wind. First of all, we all like wind energy. Secondly, I bet a lot of you would have no objections to anybody putting a windmill in their yard next door that was 25 feet tall. So you can't fairly call yourselves anti-wind. But we are, like all zoning is, concerned about tall, noisy structures operating in a residential environment. That's common sense. That's not anti-wind, that's just common sense. And if you're a county official here today, I want you to know that I know what it's like to sit on your side of the table. I sat there for 6.5 years. You're being asked to make zoning decisions for an entire county. Not just yourself, not just a few neighbors, but for an entire county. That's something that most people never expected to have to deal with when they took those commissioner or planning commission jobs. The good news is, I think if you look at my zoning strategies, and all my talk is based on an ordinance in Raga Township, the one that I refer to, ragatownship.com, the link will show up in the end, you can find it there. We realize that we think the two principles should drive land use changes this profound, this massive, and those are the principles of consent and compensation. And if you codify those into your zoning ordinance, which I hope becomes clear over time in this talk, you'll take that pressure away from your elected officials about whether a project goes forward, and it gets restored back to the private landowners, where they will be compelled to negotiate private easements with everybody who bears the ill effects of pervasive utility scale wind development, instead of just a select small number of large landowners. This is how it should work. So, I hate to go down this road. I don't know if some of you saw this post on social media. I generally ignore these things, but this is In for Wind's post about me. So here's what they said. Want to know what is behind the anti-wind groups in Cass and Miami counties? Meet Kevon Martis, a climate science denier from Michigan with ties to the fossil fuel industry and no environmental science experience. Well, this is just a little silly. I never met anybody from Cass and Miami counties personally until I got here tonight. You guys were involved in this thing for months before I ever even knew anybody was trying to build here. A climate science denier. That sounds bad. Obviously, the field of climate science exists. I don't deny that. I don't understand what they're saying. I think what they're trying to suggest is somehow I am an evil person who thinks man-made global warming is not real. Frankly, the position of our group is we don't know. That's because about half of us are Democrats who support the IICC, half of us are conservatives. In fact, my co-director is a big labor, anti-Trump Democrat. And he would not tolerate us having such a position, or he would leave. Ties to the fossil fuel industry. That, wait a minute, from Michigan. Well, that's odd. Is RES from Cass and Miami counties?
Nope.
Okay, well, how bad? I mean, I guess if you don't like our football team, I can see why you wouldn't like Michigan, but other than that, I don't see where that's relevant, except scary outsiders from Wisconsin and Colorado, I guess. Fossil fuel industry. Nonsense. We receive no funding from the fossil fuel industry, but I can tell you who's deeply associated with fossil fuels, and that's virtually the entire wind industry. If you go to the website of the American Wind Energy Association, look at their board of directors, they're a conglomeration of the largest fossil fuel utilities in the world. Look, if the fossil fuel card cuts against me, then it would have to cut against all wind developers by definition, right? So let's just drop it. It's silly. And finally, no environmental science experience. What this is a false construct. They've just created an imaginary standard for my credentials that don't exist. They've suddenly said, if you're not an environmental scientist, you're not qualified to speak about land use issues. This is common. First of all, it's bogus. There's no such requirement in Indiana state law that your planning commissioners have a degree in environmental science to be able to speak to the facts of safely regulating any type of land use in your community. Secondly, when I spoke in Huron County a few years ago, I finished my talk, Detroit Edison had representatives there, and the first thing they said to me was, well, just to be clear, Mr. Martis, you're not a lawyer, right? I said, no, that's not. And you're not a wildlife biologist, is that right? No, I am not. And you are not a acoustician, isn't that also correct? And you're not an expert on the grid, isn't that right? Well, yeah, but what are the odds of finding one single person in the United States of America that happens to be a lawyer, a wildlife biologist, an acoustician, and an expert on the grid? Again, it's a false set of rules. In their mind, they want you to believe that the only people who can be trusted are the experts, and virtually the only people in the room who can afford to bring experts are them. It's not a requirement for zoning and planning work. leaving aside these talking points and the absurdity of this thing, RES is attempting with this post to shift your county officials' focus away from fair and equitable land use regulations. They want to distract them by pointing to the largely zoning irrelevant topic of climate change and to my credentials. This is what one does when one cannot prevail on the merits. If you want more detailed rebuttal on any of these points, talk to me after. So now I better hurry up. Truth is, we're a bipartisan group with supporters from the left and the right, no ties to the fossil fuel industry. I'm not a paid lobbyist, which is curious because Brad Leland, when he worked for Apex, stood in front of 475 people and told them all that I'm a paid lobbyist for the oil industry. Type my name into the lobbyist database in Ohio and Michigan, and it doesn't come up because I'm not a paid lobbyist for anybody. And I donate my time as a volunteer, and I receive no financial compensation for my time from donations to the IICC. Sometimes folks like this will give me an honorarium for traveling, but I will tell you in Michigan I don't get paid, and I travel the entire state. So, now, who really pays me? And what's the net economic benefit been to me since 2011? And I'm spending way too much time on this topic. So how much has Kevon Martis benefited economically from his activities educating communities? I'm going to show you the number for the first time. This goes back to 2011. Yes, by far. Brilliant. I lose a little per acre, but I make up for it in volume. So, the truth is, how can I afford this expenditure absent some hidden dark money? Well, folks, you got a surprise tonight. My secret funding source is actually in the audience tonight, and I would like to ask that source to identify herself. This is my wife, Carrie. She's a pediatric intensive care nurse at the University of Michigan Hospital for the last 29 years. And she's paid very well, and she foolishly lets me squander it on these activities. And finally, the fact that RES is now using posts like that against you is an indication that they really don't want you to know what I know. And that's unfortunate. I'm more than happy to sit down calmly and dispassionately talk about the facts, which is what I'm going to do now. So, as much as I'd like to just talk about zoning issues, because they try and sell you on the economic benefits and climate change things and so forth, I have no choice but to talk about some of those things. So let's take a look at some of these things from the macroeconomic level. And by the way, most of my stuff comes out of Michigan, but there's a reason I use Michigan data. In Michigan, they publish the power purchase agreement contract price every year in a state report. In Indiana, that information is not revealed. And I found out it's not revealed because we did a FOIA request into our Public Service Commission, and in that came some information about the Wildcat One wind project that sold half its output into Michigan. And in that contract was disclosed the price. So I used that in testimony in front of the Public Service Commission, from whom I got that data in the first place. About 4 weeks later, I got a big pack of legal documents from the Indiana and Michigan Power Company saying I disclosed proprietary and confidential data, and that I needed to cease and desist. So we wrote back and said, well, here's the thing. We agree with you. It's confidential and proprietary. We see your agreement to that effect. However, we got that from a legal FOIA from the Public Service Commission, who was supposed to keep it secret. So in the event that you actually want to take action against the Public Service Commission for giving us that data, we'd be glad to testify on your behalf. We need to take a look at wind resources here. And Michigan has mainly a lot of wind development here in the thumb, we call it. And I live down here, if you're wondering. But let's compare it to Iowa. You can see the purple wind is very strong. And in fact, the bottom line is the wind speed, the average wind speed, has such a dramatic effect on how much energy you get. If you just took a turbine from Michigan and moved it to Iowa, it would produce roughly twice as much electricity every year than by placing it in Michigan. That's how big a difference. Same cost, in fact, they're a little cheaper to build in Iowa. But assuming the same cost, you get twice as much electricity by just building it somewhere other than in the thumb. Why does that matter here? Well, here's your wind map. And you see the oranges? This is all at 80 meters. Same thing, pretty poor wind resource compared to going back to Iowa. And if you look at the power purchase agreement prices over time, the purple are the prairie states out on the plains, red is Michigan's, and you see ours is shot back up as they've been pushed out of windier regions into less windy areas. I would say that in general, the Indiana contract prices are in this range, but they're substantially higher than the much better wind resources. We see that in Michigan, our PPA prices are around about 50 bucks a megawatt hour, but Missouri secured some bids into their market from Oklahoma, and you see it's down to $17 to $20. Far, far cheaper out west, much cheaper. So, what about CO2? Well, a lot of concern about that. Obviously, RES is concerned about me being a denier. Well, let's talk about it. We talk about the social cost of carbon emissions. The Obama administration said, what's the harm to our planet if we allow a ton of CO2 to be emitted? And what's that harm evaluated at in financial terms? And they said $40 for every ton of CO2 emitted. That accommodates weather extremes and all the things that are attributed to global CO2 emissions. Well, MISO did an analysis of the Obama Clean Power Plan, and they said, what's it cost to reduce CO2 emissions with wind generation? And they said if you can reduce a ton of that $40 CO2 for $237 a ton. In other words, there's 6 times the economic harm to our society from trying to offset CO2 emissions with wind than it is to just eat the CO2. And we hear a lot of talk about subsidies. This is all broken down on the energy output, but the bottom line is, it is true, coal, natural gas, and nuclear receive some federal support. Renewable electricity in general gets a lot more. Solar and wind get a really high amount of subsidies per unit of energy delivered. When they say fossil fuels get far more subsidies than wind energy, they're looking to base all the units of energy delivered year in, year out. But all I care about is what's the relative subsidy per each individual unit delivered. It's very, very high. The subsidy for wind electricity, presuming you get the full production tax credit, is roughly equal to the wholesale value of electricity in the market. That would be like Honda being gifted the entire cost of constructing a Honda car and then have them be able to dump it into the U.S. And we get this a lot. Mr. Leela always says we don't get any subsidies for wind energy. He said that at Apex. I heard him say it with RES. So what's the difference between a subsidy and a tax credit? Well, to be fair, a tax credit is not a subsidy. You'll be able to hear the huge difference. A $5 billion subsidy leaves $5 billion less in the U.S. Treasury to fund Head Start, veterans benefits, infrastructure, etc. That is much different than a $5 billion tax credit, which leaves $5 billion less in the U.S. Treasury to fund Head Start, veterans benefits, infrastructure, etc. It's a semantical game. So, an obvious question, if we have pretty mediocre wind here in this part of Indiana and in the Thumb, why are they here? Well, a little history. I think there's about 7 counties, by my count, in Indiana that have operating projects, but 15 counties have moved to block. Point 1, better wind resources in Indiana are becoming scarce. Same is true in Michigan. I'm going to go back in history a little bit. Huron County, where Mr. Leela used to work, frankly, for RES, they built and sold 2 projects there. It's been a free-for-all for wind development since 2008. It was aided and abetted by the fact that a substantial number of their planning commission members who wrote their wind ordinance in the 2007-2008 period had wind leases. But things changed. After all those turbines went in 2016, 3 Huron County townships faced even more wind development. And I'm not going into the details, but Lincoln and Sand Beach and Sherman were looking at more projects. Here's what's weird. 4 out of 5 Lincoln Township trustees had Detroit Edison wind leases. Nonetheless, they took action to remove their township from county zoning, which we can do. We have township level zoning in Michigan, in order to enact protective zoning of their own. In fact, these leaseholders told Huron County Planning Commission, we feel that Huron County has done our part as far as green energy. We feel that no additional turbines should be allowed in Huron County. They have just under 500 turbines in that county right now. Without going into the 2 details, what happened then in Michigan, we have the option to place these zoning amendments on the ballot through the referendum process. You don't have that right here. So this all happened last May. The campaign got really interesting. Detroit Edison's CEO of their electricity division, he came to, it's like they sent him to Huron County and said, go sell this thing. So here's what the ad said. Dear Huron County residents, we know that some of you may be concerned about the number of wind turbines in Huron County, and DTE is committed to addressing those concerns. We will not ask for new wind development in the county if you just give us 1 more. That's basically what it says. I promise, honey, I won't come home drunk again. Just 1 more. Just forgive me 1 more time. That's what it sounded like to me. What kind of sales point is that? They're so wonderful and beneficial for everybody that we promise we'll never give you any more. And it got really menacing. A PAC working in the Next Era project footprint said, "Why is this lawyer smiling? Vote no to protect Sand Beach Township from costly lawsuits." They basically said, vote our way or we're going to sue you. It had some teeth because they were suing a township in the neighboring county, which is in fact why it's been subpoenaed. The Huron County residents, however, fought back. They picketed and protested in front of Detroit Edison's facility in Huron County. Campaign disclosures turned out this way. They spent $875 grand, the wind companies did, PR. The local folks spent $3,700. Money always wins elections, right? Not in Huron County. 63% no, 34% yes, 36% yes. They were outspent 300 to 1. The people won't take any more turbines there. Not even the leaseholders want them. Not all of them, but even leaseholders are finally saying no. And wind losing at the ballot box despite lopsided campaign expenditures is not rare. 17 townships have had a chance to vote on wind zoning in Michigan since 2009, and wind has never won once at the township level. My point is, the majority of people living in the footprint of wind projects, given the choice, would say no. We know that again and again and again and again. Secondly, we see that when elected officials move the wrong way on this issue, the majority is moving and voting them out. More than 40 townships and 3 counties have rejected wind in Michigan now. More are following suit. No amount of PR spending by the wind companies can change those election results in Michigan. So why is RES here? Because so many other Indiana counties have already zoned them out. That's my gut feeling. There's other variables like access to grid, which I see they're having some issues with as well. So what about the money? Wind developers speak of all this great financial benefit to landowners as an inducement for permissive wind energy zoning. Remember, all that money that the wind developer promises to you is recovered from ratepayers. Somebody's paying that to them first before it comes to you, or it's coming from the U.S. Treasury. The point is, there's no free lunch here. They can also drive up the cost on your existing generation fleet, even if they export the energy out of state, because that wind comes and drives down your generators locally because they get preferential access to the grid because of the way the wholesale markets work, drives up your costs on your generators, your bill goes up, even as they collect a check from an out-of-state entity for producing energy in your backyard. There's no free lunch. Put this way, in this cartoon, the guy says, look, he's giving us all money just like he promised, and the wife quickly observes, but he has your wallet. Too often I've seen county governments be enticed by the thought of additional tax revenue without raising taxes. But in truth, placing turbines in just a few townships for countywide revenue enhancements is actually a decision to tax those few townships with loss of amenity of home and quality of life without compensation. If your entire county needs more tax revenue, then do the brave thing and raise your taxes equitably across everybody. Don't shove turbines into just a few townships and say, there, we didn't have to raise taxes, when in fact you just did, but only a few townships. I will speed up through this part, but the bottom line, the Michigan experience has been pretty negative. All across the state, wide-scale opposition. RES is trying to build a project right up here. I was there 2 weeks ago. They want to put turbines on top of Mount Arvon, the highest peak in the state. It's amazing. Even the environmentalists up there are very upset about this. It's becoming very difficult to build new wind in Michigan. They're still piggybacking upon places where they already had pre-existing approvals, but new projects are being fought down aggressively. So let's say you don't like nuclear or conventional power plants. Here's something else we've learned about wind. Here's an 1,100 megawatt Fermi plant. Detroit Edison owns it. I have a great friend who works there. Let's say you wanted to replace that with wind turbines. Well, you could put 2 V100s in every mile from Toledo to Detroit to Ann Arbor. That's a pretty big area. But you'd still have to have 1,100 megawatts of gas-fired generation somewhere because the wind often doesn't blow in July and August. Put another way, 36 square miles or one township full of turbines like this will produce roughly the same amount of energy you can get from a semi-trailer mounted gas generator that fits in your average dairy barn. And yeah, I'm out of order here. But in other words, another perspective, virtually every coal gas, you don't have any nukes in Indiana, I don't think, but all your conventional power plants in the state of Indiana would fit in 1 to 1.5 townships. That's it, only 1 to 1.5 townships. Think how many townships are already covered with wind turbines. The energy density issue is a profound issue. So, now let's get back to some zoning issues. Well, I'm going to talk to you about the total cost of ownership, because that's what you want to know, right? We're going to sell you this project, and if your community buys it, what are you going to get in exchange for what it costs? Well, it's easy to do that with cars, because we all have an opinion, or with tractors, because we all have a brand preference, and we have a lot of familiarity with them. But when somebody says we're going to build some 100-meter class Vestas V100 turbines, now you're asking questions about an unfamiliar product. When they asked me about it in 2009, we only had a few turbines in the whole state. We didn't even know what they looked like, and they were only 390 feet tall. So now the newer ones are 494, and now we're 650, 750. So here's the Mackinac Bridge. I use this in Michigan, but you see they're nearly as tall as the towers. In fact, the new ones are even taller. It's pretty astounding to consider the scale. This is what one looks like at 1,139 feet to somebody's home. I see the pictures in the back as well. I know the people that lived in that house. They abandoned it at a 35% loss in property values. The turbines made so much noise that they slept in their basement and took sleeping pills. The saddest part was when their boys went to college, they came back and had been at Michigan State, and they came back and said, wow, we're not sure we can stay here. We'd forgotten how bad it was. That's a tax. That's a tax on your quality of life. So where do you get your zoning guidance in the state of Indiana? Now I'm going to talk about zoning issues more directly, and then I'll wrap this up. The Indiana Code says zoning is to be adopted for these purposes: promoting the public health, safety, comfort, morals, convenience, and general welfare. I'm just going to shorten that to health, safety, and welfare because all my slides already say that. That's how we say it in Michigan. My point is this: if the proposed activity cannot be performed in our communities in keeping with health, safety, and welfare, it must not be permitted. Remember, a developer of any kind, I don't care who it is, adult bookstore, strip club, wind guy, I don't care, whatever you want. I hate to lump those all together, but somehow it rings a bell. Their primary commitment is to return on investment. That's their whole purpose. They have to maximize shareholder value. That's their job. But your planning official's single commitment has to be to health, safety, and welfare. So how far can you go in zoning? Well, Indiana law may be slightly different, but in general terms, you have to have a rational relationship to protecting health, safety, and welfare. They can't be arbitrary or capricious regulations that say Catholics can have 4-story houses and Presbyterians can only have 1 story. If you're not breaking those rules in general, zoning is pretty unassailable in courts. And we've seen some really big setbacks in Indiana upheld, I think, all the way to the Supreme Court. Reasonable zoning is strong. I'm going to skip that. Couple questions. Are any developers' profits more important than health, safety, and welfare? Are promised increases in tax revenue more important than health, safety, and welfare? Private property rights, claims of green jobs or emission reductions, are any of those things more important than your community's health, safety, and welfare? And the answer is no. Skip that. I'm only going to talk about a few aspects of wind development because and the negative impacts. So, and people say, why do you only talk about the bad? Well, in a zoning context, you have to understand, we don't regulate the positive things because there's no need. Right? You have to regulate the negative parts. That's the purpose of the regulation. So I have to talk about the negative aspects of wind development because that's what we focus on. So I'm not going to talk about radio frequency interference or environmental impacts like birds and bats, even though they're important, or decommissioning, which is all important. We just don't have that kind of time. I'm going to talk about height, setbacks, noise, and property values. Most developers are asking for regulations similar to this, just as a frame of reference. 500 feet plus, 45 to 55 decibel, 1,000 to 1,320 to homes, 30 hours of shadow flicker, and very small property line setbacks. So what are your limits with respect to establishing height limits? Well, we regulate structures on the basis of height all the time. And we don't do it because tall structures make people sick. Sometimes we do it just because we don't want to see tall structures. So I happen to be a residential builder. Many communities restrict me from building houses any taller than 1.5 or 2 stories. And it's not because 3 or 4-story houses can't be safely built. Of course they can. It's just simply you don't want to see tall buildings in certain parts, so you write zoning that prohibits that. Wind turbines are no different than any other lawful use. You can restrict their size for the sake of appearance. We do that with billboards. This was in North Dakota. They said the purpose of regulating signs is to provide for a visually pleasing environment. Right. Not because bigger billboards give people billboard syndrome or make them sick. It's just we don't want to see them. And I say that because the wind companies want us to talk about wind turbine syndrome because they got a lot of data they think they can make us look silly with that. You don't need that. You just simply say, it's too big. Don't want to see it. That's a fair option. And the wind companies even recognize this. Steve Rawlings is a vice president of Detroit Edison. And he says, certainly there are some pristine places in Michigan where you don't want to impact the view shed. You take a situation like Leelanau County or Old Mission Peninsula here in our region. Certainly there are areas where it just, well, it would be perfect economic sense and perfect placement for utility turbines. We probably don't want them as a region here. I can only presume that Huron County didn't meet their definition of pristine. So the question for your community is, how tall is too tall for utility scale wind turbines? Just like any other land use, it's up to you. 100 feet, 200, 3, it's up to you. Now let's talk about industry standards. We hear a lot that the wind companies are coming to say the industry standard here is 1320 to a house and 55 decibels. Well, this comes from the journal Wind Industry, published by the wind industry. And here's the safety distances of wind turbines from human structures as practiced in different regions of the world. It caught my eyes because my state is on here. 1 mile in France, 1 mile in Germany, over a mile in Manitoba. Never seen this National Research Council, but they came in at 2,500 feet. Illinois, 1,500. Riverside County, California, 2 miles. And Michigan, 1,000. So what's the industry standard for setbacks? 1,000 to 2 miles, I guess. Well, let's take a look at a couple turbine companies' safety literature. Vestas says if runaway operation should occur, the plant must be evacuated immediately by running upwind, and access to the surrounding area in a radius of at least 1,640 feet should be restricted. Nordex says in case of a fire in the nacelle or on the rotor, parts may fall off the wind turbine. In case of a fire, nobody's permitted within 1,640 feet. Well, here's one in DeKalb, Illinois, a 1,500-foot debris field, according to my friends who live there. It's only 390 feet tall. So, I just talked about these safety manuals. If you bring them up now, they will tell you they're out of date and obsolete, and they don't count, even though there's a lot of those turbines still in operation all around the world. Secondly, when you ask them for their safety manuals, they tell you they're proprietary, confidential, and you can't have them, because apparently the hard hat zone perimeter around a turbine is somehow a confidential trade secret in a way that I don't understand. My advice is to write into your ordinance a requirement that they have to give you the entire unredacted safety manual and make it part of the public application. So, ice throw. We're going to talk about this with respect to setbacks. January 23rd, 2018, that's just last month. Some ice blew off this turbine, and I think it went about 1,200 feet and damaged a neighboring building. So Wind Energy is a journal, like I said, that published this paper in 2016, and it's called Analysis of Throw Distance of Detached Objects from Horizontal Axis Wind Turbines. It's a peer-reviewed journal, which is important because wind companies will tell you a lot if you bring a paper, well, this wasn't peer-reviewed. Well, this was, and it's not in Breitbart. It's not in some right-wing fossil fuel-funded hit job outlet. This is from the journal called Wind Energy, right? Here's what they found after they analyzed things for blade throw and ice throw. It is found that while at tip speeds of 70 meters per second, normal operating conditions, pieces of blade with weights in the range of approximately 7 to 16 tons would be thrown out less than 2,300 feet for the entire range of wind turbines, and turbines operating at the extreme tip speed of 150 meters a second may be subject to blade throw of up to 1.2 miles from the turbine. For the ice throw cases, maximum distances of 328 feet, that's for one that's not turning, up to 2,000 feet for one that's operating normally, could throw chunks of ice weighing 4 to 6.5 kilograms. And then what's the purpose of this study? It says the simulations can be useful for revision of wind turbine setback standards. So you have a peer-reviewed paper from the Wind Industry Journal telling you that this purpose is to help you create safe setback standards. Seems like good peer-reviewed science to me. Despite these types of evidence, even from very wind-friendly sources, they continue to demand 1,000 to 1,400 feet from neighboring homes, not property lines, for turbines in the 400 to 500 foot class. Here's the rub. By demanding that setback distances for wind turbines be measured from a home on the adjacent properties rather than from the property line, which is typical of virtually all other zoning regulations, the wind developer is in essence asking the regulatory body to grant them an easement or trespass privileges on unleased property. We call this trespass zoning. That's a phrase I coined. The next era attorneys questioned me on that in North Dakota. They said, isn't that a phrase that you just made up? And I said, well, that's true. It is a made up phrase, just like the phrase good neighbor agreement. Said, in fact, I can't think of a phrase in the English language that somebody didn't once make up. So yes, trespass zoning, I coined that phrase, no question. They don't like the fact that I'm saying that the right to put that turbine distance to your house rather than to your private property line is an easement. But listen, if you sign this next air lease, it's called an effects easement. The owner grants to the operator a non-exclusive easement for audio, visual, view, light, flicker, noise, shadow, vibration, air turbulence, wake, electromagnetic, electric, and radio frequency interference, and any other effects attributable to wind farm or activity located on the owner's property. It's an effects easement. So if you sign a lease, you just gave them an easement. But if you live next door and your zoning authority gave them the right to do that to your property by the fiat power of zoning, they don't want it called an easement. That doesn't seem right to me. Let's take a look at this picture. If we adopt the typical wind company's recommendations of 1320 or 1415, 1,000, NextEra is still asking for 1,000 in Michigan, to the house, you'll see that the evacuation radius is much farther than your house. So you wonder if the thing caught fire, are they at least obligated to knock on the door and tell you it's on fire as they run across your property to get away from it? That's never been clear to me. Seems like a reasonable question. But you know, moving the setback radius, the safety evacuation radius back to your house still doesn't fix the problem here, because this farmer now has part of his property being used as that evacuation zone. That's an easement. And it's also made it very difficult to build on that property anymore. Maybe that farmer has a daughter who's going into the business. He wants to build back there now. He cannot. He's just put it inside that evacuation zone. You need to move it to the property line. That's just basic land use policy. You pay taxes on your entire piece of property. The setbacks need to protect your entire piece of property. They say, well, we can't build with large setbacks. And my answer is, just because your business model requires shoving a size 12 foot into a size 9 shoe doesn't mean we need to make that happen. So am I just making this up? Well, here's a wind map from an Exelon project in Sanilac County. Hard to see the lines. I'll zoom in a little bit, but these orange lines are the 1320 setback perimeter. The gray parcels in the middle are unleased farm ground. The green parcels are leased. You can see these house lots down here are not leased. And the green parcels, I don't think have any farms on them, so it's an absentee landlord situation, landowner. If you zoom in on this guy's parcel in the middle, that farm has virtually 50% of his property now inside the evacuation radius. That seems unreasonable. You say, well, I have the right to do whatever I want on my private property. Oliver Wendell Holmes said, the right to swing my fist ends where your nose begins. My corollary says, if my development project requires me to repeatedly punch you in the nose, I should at least first get your consent and then compensate you for your broken nose. The express goal of zoning regulations is to separate conflicting uses of land. By establishing setbacks and noise limits from neighboring homes rather than property lines, the conflicting use is actually granted legal access to the neighboring property without consent or compensation. This is fundamentally unjust. The New York Supreme Court, which is not their highest court, but nonetheless, they said the same thing. The applicant has stated the 1,750-foot setback exceeded the industry standard, but nonetheless, such setback has impacted upon the use and or prospective use of adjacent properties of non-participating landowners without their consent. The property then of the non-participating landowner is in effect taken by this governmental action without compensation or consideration. I've been saying that since 2011. The New York Supreme Court agrees with me. So what's the right setback distance? Well, I would think at least 1640 to a property line, at least, for 500-foot class turbines. But if you're looking at this latest data on blade throw and ice throw and these kinds of things, you might be able to justify setbacks of a mile or more. It's up to your community. And if you want to use distance as a proxy for noise, which is complicated, 1.25 miles is also reasonable. There's nothing more ugly than trying to see a community enforce its noise ordinance against a wind company. You're going to be hiring dueling acousticians, and you're going to have people's eyes glazed over as they talk about L10, L90, LEQ, Lmax, and all manner of things that none of us really understand. If you set a big setback distance limit, you don't need the noise limit. And you can look at our Ragged Township ordinance, but what we did, and this is a part that I think you should consider in your communities, we did really big setbacks to non-participating property lines, 4 times the height, small setbacks to lease holders' homes, 1,000 feet or 1320. You could reduce both of those by signing a waiver. What that means is the wind company now has to negotiate an easement with everybody who lives around the wind turbines instead of just a few large landowners. That's fair. You don't have to have your property stripped from you through the fiat power of government. Instead, you get to negotiate an easement just like the landowner got to do next door. That's fair. That's reasonable. equitable wind energy zoning should not forcibly donate unleased property to the neighboring landowner's tenants. Think about it. That easement isn't even being donated to your neighbor who you may like. It's donated to his or her tenant, the guy who rented his farm to put a turbine there for a while. That just boggles the mind. So, how loud is too loud, and who do you believe? And I am wrapping it up here, folks. Well, the turbine project in the Garden Peninsula, in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, has 14 turbines is all, but 73 turbine neighbors signed complaints saying we can't stand the noise. Roughly 1,400 feet from the homes at 425 or 450 foot turbines. Wind companies will tell you, well look, normal conversational speech or refrigerator is 40 decibels. But what they don't tell you is in your community at night, most places, unless you're next to a highway or something, you're only hearing 20 to 30 decibels. So you're taking the right to produce 4 to 8 times more noise around your house every night than what you would normally experience when it's quiet. Well, what's the safe limit? And this is all the more I'm going to say about whether or not wind turbine noise causes health impacts. The World Health Organization studied noise on nighttime sleeping patterns and health impacts. And I don't see how wind turbine noise is any different than any other noise source. So they did come up with decibel levels that they recommend. They said up to 30 decibels, you don't see any effect on people's health. 30 to 40 decibels, this isn't long-term average at night. You'll see some body movements, awakening, sleep disturbance. Average effects may be modest. Young, chronically ill, elderly are affected to a greater degree. That's still pretty quiet and it's not a dramatic impact. 40 to 55 decibels, you see a sharp increase in adverse health effects. Exposed populations have to adapt coping mechanisms and vulnerable groups are severely affected. And above 55, adverse health effects occur frequently. High percentage of population is highly annoyed and limited evidence suggests that the human cardiovascular system is stressed. I don't know. I mean, is the World Health Organization anti-wind? I don't think so. I think they've just given us sound guidance on what the right noise limits are for wind turbines, whether it suits the viability of a developer's project or not. How about George Hessler? He's an acoustician. He and his son have done a lot of work for the wind industry, but the state of Minnesota hired them to do a study on wind turbine noise levels, and they said it would be advisable for any new project to attempt to maintain a mean sound level of 40 decibels or less outside all residences, an ideal design goal. This one's interesting. We got some folks here from Ontario. Curiously, even with this low noise limit, you see they are obviously able to still build there, but here they tell us 40 decibels is unreasonable. But NextEra said this, and this is from their frequently asked questions section in NextEra Canada. It says the Ontario Ministry of Environment sound guidelines for rural areas establishes maximum permissible sound levels at residences of 40 decibels. But they didn't stop there. I love this part, which is consistent with the standards set by the US EPA. So they're saying the 40 decibel limit in Canada is consistent with our US EPA. Yet NextEra demands a right for 50 to 55 decibels in the United States in the tip of the thumb. You do the math. Am I an anti-wind kook, or am I just telling the truth? We did a 40 decibel nighttime noise limit at non-participating property lines. We did 45 decibel daytime noise limits. We added some low frequency protection as well. And those noise limits also were waivable. You could raise those noise limits if you wanted to be a neighbor to a wind turbine and you agreed, arrange an appropriate easement with the wind company. I'm going to skip that. So now, property values. Now, if anybody's raised the question of property values, I bet you $100 they've brought this report, the wind companies have brought this report in because they've been handing it into townships since 2009, done by the Lawrence Berkeley Lab, paid for by the Department of Energy, and it says there's no statistical evidence of loss of property values by having a house next to wind turbines. And they say that's it. The US government paid for the study, it's the gold standard. Well, the author of that study said, I think one of the things that often happens is that wind developers put our report forward and say, look, property values aren't affected. And that's not what we would say specifically. On the other hand, they have little ground to stand on if they say we won't guarantee that. So if they hand you that report and say, well, are you also willing to offer us a property value guarantee? What they have often told us is, well, we're not in the real estate business. Well, either are we in the wind turbine business. There are 3 studies out there that seem to suggest no loss of property values. There's about 11 studies that show substantial loss of property values. You can understand why they prefer the one batch and not the other. One of the more powerful ones comes from that right-wing anti-climate change, fossil fuel-funded hit group, the London School of Economics, which showed an 11% loss of property values in the United Kingdom from living next door to wind turbines. Excuse me being snarky, but I'm kind of tired. So, I am very much getting close to the end now. You may be thinking, this guy makes wind sound way worse than it is. I drive through Benton County and it seems just fine. Sure, you can always find some whiners, but they are only a handful. Good question. Seems reasonable. I had to answer that question for myself as a planning commissioner because I drove to a wind project in Michigan. Some people said they loved them. Some people said they hated them. What's a planning commissioner supposed to do with that information? How are you supposed to decide? It's hard to know. Well, we have some data. Remember I said the Berkeley lab did the property value stuff that the wind companies like, paid for by the Department of Energy? They just released a study last month about attitudes towards wind development by wind neighbors. Same company, same lab, same funding source, gold standard, wind company says on property values. And this is the header from that thing. So, one caveat before I get into this. The data appears sound, is my opinion, but the impacts are severely diluted by including people who live within 5 miles of a turbine. Well, if you live where I do and you can look 30 miles to the horizon, you know that 5 miles is almost an entire township away. That's a very large data pool, and that dilutes the stuff a whole bunch. Secondly, I've never claimed that wind turbines have much impact on people besides visual beyond 1.5 miles, maybe 2 miles. So they're including a lot of people out there that I've never suggested were having much negative effect except some impacts on their view shed. Nonetheless, they broke it down into setback categories, which made it much more useful to us. Now the part that I saw In for Wind post on their Facebook page says, great news, only 8% of the people near turbines have any problems, so 92% have no objections. Yeah, but that's up to 5 miles away. Because you would say it's just a bunch of whiny cranks and a small minority, right? Fortunately, they zoomed in on this and said, what is your attitude towards the local wind project now? You see, when you get within 1/2 mile, about 25% of the people have strong objections. And I wish they'd gone down one gradation closer. How about within 1,500 feet? So 1 out of 4 people inside a project for wind footprint really have concerns about it after it's in operation. And as you can see in Huron County, right, people didn't accept them over time. The more turbines went in, the stronger the political opposition became. Secondly, virtually everybody inside what we would consider the project footprint is going to be within 1/2 mile of a turbine. So really the 1/2 mile data is the only one that matters. You get 1 mile to 2 miles away, I'm not even sure you're in the footprint anymore. So I would throw that data out, but they did not. So go back to that previous slide though, 25% of the people living in those turbine clusters don't like it. And you'll say, well, maybe that's an acceptable loss. But you have to remember, right now in your county, nobody's being annoyed by wind turbines. 0% right now. Now, can you hear turbines? How many times have we seen it on Facebook? I stood right under it and they don't make any noise. Well, within 5 miles, 16% still say they can hear them of that large pool. Within 1 mile, 56% say they can hear these things that don't make any noise. And within 1/2 mile, 81% of the people say they can hear these silent wind turbines. Get this, and I wish they had broken this data out because I'd really like to have the answer to it. Those who were reported ever hearing sound were asked if they heard sound from the turbines from inside their home with the windows open or with the windows closed. To the question of whether turbines could be heard with the windows open, 60% said yes, 40% said no. 10% of all respondents within 5 miles, which is way too big, reported hearing turbine sounds inside their home with the windows open. To the question of whether turbines can be heard with the windows closed, 1 out of 3 said yes. 5% of all respondents within 5 miles of turbine reported hearing turbine sounds inside their home with windows closed. Folks, turbines are not silent. It's not a whisper. It's not a quiet library like the acoustician tried to tell us. People hear them inside their homes, over the TVs, like in the Garden Peninsula. If you're within 1,500 feet from a wind turbine, you're going to know it's there. Now, maybe your community is going to decide that's just fine, but I don't want you to make that decision under the false assumption that you're never going to hear them. So, what do people think about the visual impacts? Oh, excuse me. Distribution of respondents reporting annoyance to turbine sounds. Respondents who have heard turbine sounds and are within 1/2 mile, more than 50% are slightly, somewhat, moderately, or very annoyed. The majority of people living with 1/2 mile wind turbines find the noise annoying. That may translate to thousands of Miami and Cass County residents. Again, currently nobody's being annoyed by wind turbine noise in your county. And finally, the change to the landscape. A large percentage of people do not like the visual impacts of wind turbines, 42% of them within 1/2 mile. So whatever is being foisted upon you, statistically, according to the Department of Energy, a non-trivial number of people are really not going to like it. But even 3 to 5 miles away, 30% of the people are annoyed by the sight of wind turbines, even at that great a distance, just by seeing them. Nobody is being annoyed by the visual impacts today. So what's my point? That study has validated everything I've been saying for years. 1, wind turbine noise is loud enough to be heard inside homes. 2, a large percentage of people living within a mile of wind turbines are annoyed by the sight and sound. Even at a great distance, wind turbines are a visual stigma to many turbine neighbors. Secondly, by coupling the ice and blade throw data from the Wind Industry Journal with this other report I just talked about, we see that the industry is finally having to face the simple fact that we have been maintaining for years. Utility-scale wind development adversely affects a large number of people when placed too closely to homes. The question is no longer 1,000 or 1,320 feet. It's clearly a matter of a 1/2 mile or 1.25 miles. Wrapping up. I keep saying that and I never wrap up. Most land use changes are pretty benign, and you can argue about what size of signs you want in your community and so forth, and people will make an argument about 30 square feet, 40 square feet. But wind turbines are nothing like that kind of argument. They're disproportionately large. We felt that that kind of land use change should not occur in our community without the consent and compensation of the people bearing the direct impacts. 2-stage setbacks and waivers for both noise and distance are fair and restore the bargaining power of everybody who lives next to it. Remember when I said by putting this kind of zoning in, your county doesn't have to decide whether the project goes forward or not. The developer can decide, and the way they can make it go forward is they can buy enough easements to make it permissible so that everybody in the footprint says okay. As long as we keep giving them milk for free, they're never going to give us the cow, or they're never going to buy the cow. And that's what we're up against here, folks. So remember, nobody ever came to your county board and said, the light coming through my windows is too steady, could you make it flicker? Nobody ever said the nighttime noise level is too quiet, could you raise it to 55 from 25? Or my property values are too stable, could you build some 50-story industrial machines next door to put that value at risk? The bottom line of zoning is we were here first, we get to decide. There are only 2 types of wind ordinances. The one that the wind industry wants you to preserve here in your 2 counties gives them those free easements. I think reasonable zoning demands that those easements be negotiated between the developer and the impacted landowners rather than forced on them by a small number of elected or appointed officials. Last slide, I promise. If you agree with me that the current regulations in your 2 counties are not adequate to protect your private property rights and your quality of life, what can you do now? Well, listening to my talk doesn't change the hearts and minds of your policymakers. It's kind of like coming to church, right? You come and you hear an inspiring sermon. I don't know if I've been inspiring, but you hear a sermon, you say, oh, that's great. And then you go home and you cuss and you yell at your kids and you're a jerk at work. If you don't act, nothing changes. And so my point is, if you feel that I've made a credible case on what kind of zoning your county should be adopting, if you think your private property rights should be protected by strong setback numbers to your private property lines, it's going to be up to you to convince your elected officials that that's the way this county should go. And I can't tell you how to do that, but I can tell you that it's best done like the wind companies do. Meet with your policymakers politely, privately, over coffee, in homes, in groups of 1 or 2 or 3. They need to see that we're real people with real and valid concerns and that property rights are meaningful. Secondly, it doesn't hurt to say, you know what, if this is really about the tax revenue, we would support an effort to raise the millage by a $0.5 mil or something instead of this. We're more than happy to help fund our own things, but we don't think a small percentage of our landowners and a small part of our county should fund those things for the rest of us. My talk is based on the Raga Township Wind Ordinance, which is here. And secondly, since I'm not really funded by Big Fossil, please consider a donation to us at iiccUSA.org. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are going to take a 5 or 10 minute break to stand up, stretch your legs, Back there at the back of the room, there are cards and boxes to write questions. If you have questions now or you're thinking of something, go take some time to write some questions. And then we're going to gather back, and we do have a couple that has traveled here from Canada. They live in a wind farm, and they're going to share their personal experience of what they've lived through. And then we're going to have a question and answer session based on those questions that have been written down. So, quick break, go to the bathroom if you have to, and then we'll gather back.